Well, I wanted to take a moment to talk you guys through how to produce a quality paper. From what I saw and what was submitted for the midterm papers, I think most folks would benefit from having a short tutorial on proper paper setup and also how to produce an actual argument paper. Because what I saw was primarily two separate types of papers. I saw some folks who attempted to write an actual argument paper, while there were some folks who produced primarily a summary or a report. And most of you, I sent feedback and explained that I would like to see a further draft of this paper. I will give you all a week from today to produce a new paper based on what I'm about to show you. First and foremost, make sure that your papers are set up in proper MLA formatting. It should consist of your first and last name in the upper left-hand corner, your professor's name underneath yours, the class number underneath the professor name, the date that the paper was completed. There should be a header, which includes your last name and the page number. To get that up top in the upper right hand corner, you'll double click in the right hand corner. You will go to page number and you will add a page number in the upper right hand corner and then type in your last name. Double click to exit and you'll know you've done it right when that information is grayed out. The next bit of information that you need is some kind of title. So for this working paper that I just sort of wrote up quickly, I titled it Identity Formation in a Narrative of the Captivity and Restoration of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson. Please take note that in this title, because it is a longer narrative, it is italicized. Remember that the titles of longer works such as books, long autobiographies, movie titles, those are represented in italics, whereas the titles of poems are represented with quotation marks and no italics. I saw a couple folks mix that up. So in terms of introductions, you want to have a couple of things happen here. You want to give the reader a general background and idea of what you're going to be covering in your paper, and you also want to provide a clear thesis statement that is going to detail exactly what you're going to argue in later body paragraphs. If you do not have a thesis statement, likely what is going to happen is by the time I make it to the body paragraphs, I will have no idea what you're trying to argue because you don't have a framework that you are trying to evolve. So here's the quick introduction that I wrote up. So authors write in such a way as to position themselves or those they are covering in a particular light. The intention is likely to bias the reader to the author's particular perspective of the subject at hand. In terms of the first person narrative scribed through the medium of a memoir or autobiography, the author likely frames a narrative in such a way as to present him or herself in the best manner possible. They are, to be sure, preserving their narrative for future generations and would like to be remembered as the hero or as the innocent character. Mary Rowlandson, in her narrative of the captivity and restoration of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson, in fact succeeds in casting herself as the innocent victim of her pitiless captors, fashioning a narrative that intends to shape readers' interpretations of Mary as the victim and the Native Americans as what she calls savages. Rowlandson succeeds in shaping this dichotomous representation through biblical allusions and symbolic comparisons. Ultimately, Rowlandson produces a narrative in which she is a devout follower of Christian ideals and is one who is tested at the hands of devils who seek to torment her. My thesis statement is highlighted in red here. What I will show the reader in my paper is that Rowlandson succeeds in shaping an idea of herself as victim and Native Americans as these evil captors through these two ways, specifically biblical allusions and symbolic comparisons. So, what I'm going to touch on first, based on this thesis statement, this is actually called a blueprint thesis statement because what the blueprint does is it demonstrates to the reader two things. Number one, what my main argument is going to be, and number two, the process by which I'm going to do it. So my argument is that Rowlandson succeeds in shaping herself as the victim through both biblical allusions and symbolic comparisons. Next, I have a transition in my first body paragraph that highlights the first thing that I'm going to talk about. One of the first ways through which Rowlandson frames herself as the victim and her captors as evil is through her use of biblical allusions, which render her as an object of pity and her captors as men and women akin with all that is evil. Notice that I have repeated biblical allusions here, which is identical to what I have in this thesis statement. That is incredibly important because this word right here clues my reader into the fact that this is the first thing that I'm going to be touching on in my argument. And specifically, everything that I discuss in this body paragraph is not only going to touch on biblical allusions, but it is also going to connect those biblical allusions back to my main argument that Mary Rowlandson attempts to frame herself as the victim of these evil people, and that those Native Americans are unjust in their treatment towards her. So that's my transitional phrase. The first example of this dichotomous representation is when she writes, quote, "They, like inhumane creatures, laughed and rejoiced to see it, though I thought we should there have ended our days, as overcome with so many difficulties. But the Lord renewed my strength still, and carried me along, that I might see more of his power, yea, so much that I could never have thought of, had I not experienced it." End quote. So my quotation I'm framing as one of the first examples of this biblical allusion. And based on this quotation, it's not readily apparent that this is a biblical allusion. Thus, my job as a writer is to show my reader how that particular quotation is supposed to represent a biblical allusion. So, good rule of thumb is after every quotation you use, you need to have at least 2 to 4 sentences of discussion that relate that quotation back to the main argument you are making as a whole, but also that narrowed particular focus for that body paragraph. So, here's what I say. In this example, Rowlandson frames her captors as those who are, quote, inhumane creatures, akin almost to the biblical representation of devils. And if I was writing this paper out fully, I would likely need some kind of quotation here in between these two sentences to demonstrate how I arrived at the conclusion that this is similar to a biblical representation of a devil. She goes on, however, to cast herself as like Jesus when he is tempted in the desert by Satan, framing herself as a strong Christian woman withstanding the test of evil. What I would likely have right here is an example directly from the Bible where Jesus is tempted by Satan in the desert. In presenting the narrative in this way, Rowlandson is crafting a narrative that produces a presentation of self and other that secures her status as victim of a vicious attack and the Native Americans as those who delight in harming others. So what I want for you guys to do when you go back and try to redraft these papers is think about an argument that you can make about your particular chosen material, whatever that is. And I want you to think about how you are going to produce that argument. So what are maybe 2 to 3 main talking points that will be the primary focus of each of your body paragraphs? Ensure that each body paragraph has its own main discussion point and that you don't jump around from idea to idea, ultimately losing the reader because you don't focus on one specific thing and handle that before moving on to the next. The other thing that I want you to be very, very careful about is when you are quoting material, you have to make sure to quote that material not only as it's represented in the text, but also with the proper citation and documentation. So notice how in this quotation, taken directly from your Norton Anthology, I have my in-text citation as Rowlandson 272. So even though this material is found in the Norton Anthology, it is written by Mary Rowlandson, located specifically on page 272 of the Norton Anthology. There were a fair number of folks who perhaps had quotations or summaries from source material that did not include proper citation or quotations. If you do not have quotations, or if you do not have in-text citations for quotes or summaries, it is considered plagiarism. You have to make sure, too, that all of your quotations are formatted properly. So, for instance, this is a quote from a autobiography. So you quote it just like you would if you were quoting from a journal article or a novel. If you're quoting poetry, you have to quote poetry a little differently. So, for instance, let's say we are quoting, let's find Edgar Allan Poe. Bear with me. Oops. So for quoting lines of poetry, what you'll notice is that each line is written out in this way. So each line is on its own quote-unquote line. When you're quoting poetry, you have to count off each line, which would represent the particular number that you would need if you were doing an in-text citation for a poem. Let's pretend that we're going to quote these first 4 lines of this poem. So it was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. So if I go back to my paper, we just pretend that we are writing a paper about Edgar Allan Poe. Oops. Keep happening. There we go. In order to represent lines of poetry, you have to separate each subsequent line by a backslash, which helps to indicate that there are actually line breaks in between each of these. What a lot of folks were doing was just quoting this material as if it were lifted from something like an autobiography or an essay, where with poetry you have to make sure to indicate that there are specific line breaks so that when a reader is looking through your paper, he or she can see that each of these slash marks is indicative of separate lines. Notice too that when I perform that in-text citation, it's in-text citation style for 1 through 4 because I'm quoting lines 1, 2, 3, 4. If I was quoting just those lines, my in-text citation would change to the following. As I mentioned, I would like for all of you to please get in contact with me concerning meeting with me to discuss your papers. Please email me as soon as you can, and I look forward to meeting with you guys. Let me know if you have specific questions about